Diana Conway, and I'm the president of the Women's Democratic Club, a vibrant organization with hundreds of politically active women and men, including many elected officials. I hope you will consider becoming a member or renewing your membership with us. Today, we've got a great speaker for you. Virginia Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger is with us on behalf of the Biden campaign. I'm going to make a few quick announcements and then introduce our speaker. Following Congresswoman Spanberger's remarks, we'll have some Q&A. So here are some announcements. Our next speaker will be Virginia Senator Mark Warner on Friday, June 19th at 1 p.m. and that registration is open now. We're working to schedule a bunch of other very exciting speakers, so please do stay tuned. In addition to speakers, WDC is facilitating ways for our members and our friends to take concrete action. We are working with groups like Do the Most Good, MoCo Women, the Silver Spring Progressive Action, and Maryland Women for Biden, among others, and hosting weekly GOTV Get Out the Vote events. This includes letter writing, postcard writing, phone banking, text banking. Everyone will walk you through whichever one you choose and train you. There is something that fits everyone's schedule and your comfort level, and even better, use this as an opportunity to get used to expanding your comfort level. There's a time for this now, because being distraught is no longer enough. We need to turn that into motivation and take on action so that we're ready for the late Congressman Elijah Cummings' question, which is, quote, how will you answer when you are asked, what did you do? So in addition to working with those organizations I just named, I hope people will join a civil rights organization, participate in peaceful protests, and bring someone with you. Educate yourself and others on the lived experience of Black and Brown Americans. I highly recommend the podcast, The 1619 Project. It's a podcast by New York Times reporter, Pulitzer Prize winner, Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's shattering. Also to engage in community dialogues, work with community support organizations, and contribute time and treasure to a campaign or two. So we're running out of time for November, and we cannot sit back and ponder how to step into the ring. As Stacey Abrams put it in her New York Times op-ed last week, quote, voting alone will not save us, but silence will surely damn us all. In other words, our actions have consequences, and so does our inaction. Okay, let's move on to our speaker, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. Congresswoman Spanberger is the first Democrat to hold the Virginia 7th District seat in 50 years. She beat incumbent David Bratt, who you may remember outflanked the then House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, who was no moderate himself. She represents 10 counties throughout Central Virginia, and her career in public service began when she was serving as a federal agent investigating money laundering and narcotics cases, and then serving as a case officer with the CIA. As a CIA officer, she worked at home and abroad to collect vital intelligence to keep our country safe and support our national security priorities. She serves on the House Committee for Agriculture and on the Committee for Foreign Affairs. On the Ag Committee, she chairs the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee. And on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Spanberger serves as Vice Chair for the Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and Environment Subcommittee. Representative Spanberger earned her BA at the University of Virginia and her MBA at a dual degree program between Purdue University and the GISMA School, the business school in Hanover, Germany. She lives in Glen Allen in Henrico County with her husband and 3 children. And as an accomplished public servant and surrogate for the Biden campaign, WDC is very excited to welcome Congresswoman Spanberger, and I will see you on the other side of her remarks for Q&A.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you all today. And Diana, thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you also for advocating for engagement in so many ways that are important, educating ourselves on the issues of policy and community engagement that matter deeply to the constituents I represent, to our neighbors across Maryland and across Virginia and across the country. Engaging on issues of political importance so we know why it is we are getting out to vote in November and why it is that we support the candidates whom we support. Across the 2018 election, when I was running for the first time, I heard from so many people who would say, you know, what's the point? Voting doesn't matter. There was a level of doubt and a level of uncertainty that so many people expressed. And I think that when I was able to have direct conversations with voters, or when someone from my campaign team, a volunteer or a staffer, had conversations to talk about why it matters and how policy is impacted, of course, by those who make it, we were really able to engage and talk about what is important in our community and why voting matters. And I know, given the concept behind this group, that I don't have to impress upon you why voting matters, but I do want to impress upon you why I think it's so incredibly important that you are engaging in the political process, advocating for candidates, and doing so from a position of informed recognition of the policies that they want to pursue. Because in recent weeks, and I'll speak very succinctly on, in the past 2 weeks, we have seen a coming together of people based on anguish, based on anger, based on desperation. We have seen people across the district that I represent marching in the streets, having rallies, speaking of their anger, their sadness, their desperation, their desire for change. And while all of this came from the horrific video of the murder of one man, this time, with a police officer with his knee on his neck, and yet another occurrence of murder of a Black man in America by a uniformed police officer. The tragedy of it was so, so deep. And I recently heard a local rabbi talk about it this way. He said that with COVID-19, we were starting to be wounded. With the death of Ahmaud Arbery, it ripped open a wound in our country's history and in the divisions of racism that are so persistent across our communities. And that with the murder of George Floyd, we just let out. We just could no longer uh, not respond fiercely and ferociously to this, because the wound of watching Mr. Arbery's murder on film was so, so fresh, that watching the death of George Floyd became something so undeniable, that at all levels of our community, people have rallied for the cause of justice. And so when we think about where we are as a country, we are in a time of great uncertainty. We are in a time, as John Lewis recently said on a phone call with the Democratic caucus, a time also of hope. He said his call to all of his colleagues on the phone were, don't be weary, keep working. He said he had never seen, in all his years in the civil rights movement, he'd never seen a coming together of such diverse groups of people coming together. I believe he said, sharing the good word and fighting for justice. And so this is a time for us to pursue not just justice for George Floyd, but justice in our systems, in our environmental systems, in our economic systems, in our healthcare systems, in our educational systems, in our criminal justice systems, where we are focused on the concept of equity and where we are pursuing justice for all people. And as we are trying to move, and it will be a slow trajectory, out of the impact of COVID-19, particularly as the virus continues to spread, the focus on doing so in a way where we are bringing people back into the economy, where we are advocating for health equity that will ensure that in the future we do not see such disparate levels of death between our African American neighbors and our white neighbors, as we continue to see with COVID-19. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you all, because across the country there is so much at stake with this election, and I could go on and on and on, and I will wait for the questions to do so. But I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be here and to speak to some of the reasons why I am supporting Vice President Biden for the presidency, why I believe that his election is so vital to us taking steps forward for the cause of justice, why his election is so important to the priority of restoring our country's place in the world, towards working on issues and policies that will positively impact people's lives and create greater opportunity, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you a little bit more about some of his priorities, what we're seeing across the country, and what we need to do towards November.
Terrific, thank you. So we've had questions flowing in at a steady clip, in addition to the ones that came in before. So I'm going to start right in. As a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, you've witnessed firsthand President Trump's damage to the moral standing and influence of the United States. In what ways will President Biden restore America's standing and influence in the world?
So I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm a former CIA officer, as Diana mentioned in my introduction. So the place and the standing of the United States in the world, the role of our State Department, of our intelligence community, is incredibly important to me because I know that the work of our public servants is so vital to our safety and security abroad. I would note first and foremost that Vice President Biden, in addition to his years as vice president for President Obama, he also spent a dozen years as either the chair or the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He knows just about every foreign leader there is across the world and understands the tremendous responsibility that the United States has on the world stage and the role that our engagement on the world stage really is meant to play, both for our own national security and for our engagement worldwide. I would just use one quick example to note that in so many cases, as it relates to COVID-19, there were warnings that this pandemic would be bad, would be different. But in fact, it had been the administration that took away the USAID PREDICT program, which had people on the ground to predict in China where there might be potential pandemics. We had a physician on the ground in Wuhan because we know that pandemics frequently start in that region. We have seen in Republican and Democratic administrations alike, the Bush and the Obama years, that an aggressive level of international engagement, proactive in our pursuit of the ability to fight pandemics overseas before they ever reach our borders, is predicated on a responsible level of international engagement. And so first and foremost, our next president, President Biden, would have to focus on repairing some of the damage that's been done with the relationships between the United States and foreign countries and foreign leaders, and restore a level of trust that the world has in the United States. And I know that this is something that Vice President Biden is ready on day one to do because of his work in tough negotiations, pushing key arms control deals through the Senate, working on the working as the one overseeing the withdrawal of 150 combat troops out of Iraq as he was vice president. And I know that at this point in time, it's also a matter of putting a focus back on diplomacy, ensuring that we are, and this is from a congressional side, funding the United States State Department, but doing one step more than that, respecting the work of diplomacy, understanding the value of international engagement, and prioritizing a strong element of U.S. leadership in the world, because it benefits not only our own people and our own security, but it is the leadership that has long been expected of us and the role that we have long played on the world stage.
Great, thank you. The next one is, of the many pieces of legislation on Mitch McConnell's desk that the House sent over, which ones would you and the campaign like to see moved on first?
So I'm pleased that the Biden campaign has been so positive in their engagement on issues from gun violence prevention to environmental policy to the Violence Against Women Act. We have sent over hundreds of pieces of legislation, many of them bipartisan pieces of legislation that have yet to come up for a vote. So I don't want to speak for what a President Biden, how he might engage or advocate within the administration's coordination with the Senate, but what I would surely love to see movement on, I would love to see a Senate that would take up H.R. 8, which is our background check bill. It received bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. I believe that if it were taken up, even in the current configuration of the Senate, it would pass right now, which is one of the reasons why it won't get taken up. The Biden administration is prioritizing forward movement in healthcare policy, ensuring additional Americans have healthcare coverage through a public option plan. The Biden administration has been very, very clear on its commitments to equality and equity. We did pass the Equality Act in the House of Representatives, and my expectation is that that would be one of the priorities of the Biden administration to ensure that we are affirming that our LGBTQ neighbors have the same legal rights as anyone else. And of course, the Biden administration, as has been a consistent point of advocacy for them, but certainly in more recent weeks after watching Wisconsin and Georgia and the primaries there, the Biden administration has been very strong, or the potential future Biden administration, excuse my wishful thinking, has been really positive and forward-leaning on issues related to voting rights and ensuring the ability of Americans across the country to exercise the right that they have safely, particularly during the times of a pandemic. So I appreciate his advocacy on that. And while we don't currently have legislation on that front sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, my hope would be under a Biden administration, we would begin to prepare for a future where we ensure that every American, well, we do have actually the Voting Rights Act, HR 4, I believe it is. That one is on Mitch McConnell's desk. So hopefully that one would get passed into law as well.
Great. So this combines a couple different questions. Now that Maryland's primary is over and we're becoming an export state for our activists, which races in Virginia can we help with? And I'm going to combine that with the question, what are the top 3 things we can do to help Joe Biden win in November?
So I'm going to give this opinion, and I think that most people would agree with me. This race is not about just winning the presidency. It is about ensuring that President Biden heads the White House with an incredible mandate. And so as I appreciate Maryland being such an export state when it comes to its participation in nearby Virginia from an activist and advocate standpoint. And I think it's going to be districts like mine, districts like Elaine Luria's, the 5th district, which there's a competitive race there, and we might flip that seat. Of course, Jennifer Wexton's seat, while a little bit more secure on the Democratic side of the aisle, we never want to lose sight of recent gains. You know, my goal for Virginia is that all of us, the 3 of us who flipped our seats in 2018, that we return, that in doing so, we ensure upward momentum and votes all the way up the ticket. In Virginia, Mark Warner will be on the ballot again to maintain his Senate position, that we potentially flip another seat in neighboring Virginia's 5th district, and that in doing so, Virginia, even though we are likely to go blue at the presidential level, that we send a strong mandate and a clear popular vote win in our home state. And I think if we're focused on these sorts of efforts on the ground, tactical, which is the way that we campaign in congressional races, if we're doing that in Pennsylvania, and we're doing that in Michigan, and we're doing that in Florida, the same sort of, you know, pushing votes up to the top of the ticket will result in not only a win across the country, both in popular vote and in electoral college, but really ensure that the mandate is very, very clear for a Biden administration. And so what you can do to help, you know, engage with campaigns that are of interest, engage with campaigns that need volunteers, particularly during this pandemic. So many of us are adjusting rather aggressively to how it is that we campaign. There's a lot more virtual work, which, you know, as much as I love inviting people from other places to come to Virginia's 7th district and knock doors and see the beauty of Central Virginia, you can make phone calls from the comfort of your own home, either early in the stages of the campaign, so starting now to make sure people know who's on the ballot, make sure people know that the vote is upcoming, make sure people know whether or not they're registered, where they'll vote, and then certainly much later, and because we will have vote from home or mail-in voting options, and we'll be encouraging people, particularly those who might be at higher risk for COVID, to do so, making sure people know how to vote absentee, either in person or by mail, and make sure that they recognize that their vote matters. And so that advocacy can be done by postcard writing, by phone banking, either with a congressional campaign or directly with the Biden campaign. And in districts like mine, you know, a lot of that heavy lifting is going to be happening at the congressional level. And I'm happy to do it. And my goal is to ensure that I win, I go back to Congress, and that I also can ensure, you know, a success all the way up the ticket.
Great, thank you. Has the campaign prepared any plans that you know of to reunite the caged children, each of whom is a person of color, with their families?
So to my knowledge, and this my answer, I'll just caveat it, these are not direct conversations that I've had on this particular topic with the campaign, though I would note that Vice President Biden has been very, very clear in his call for a significant change to our immigration policies, one that does keep families together. The House of Representatives actually passed a bill, I believe it was quite literally called the Keep Families Together Act, rejecting policies that separate children from their parents. The Biden campaign has been very strong. The vice president has been very strong in his denunciation of barbaric practices of taking children from their families. But I don't have the full details on how they would reverse and address and what the time frame would be on uniting children who have already been separated.
That's fair enough. What can Congress do to avoid another voting debacle like we've seen in Georgia and even more locally in Baltimore?
So at this point in time, Congress, and I'll say Congress, and let me divide it out to House of Representatives and the Senate. So the House of Representatives is very focused on this issue with our Democratic majority, recognizing that many of those across the country who are facing challenges, and we just saw it in Georgia, are communities of color, more disadvantaged economically areas where there have been changes or movement of polling places, closures of polling places, for those who may not have access to regular transportation, for those who have jobs that they cannot take a day off of work in order to vote. The infringement on their ability to vote has been severe, and it is focused in an intentional effort at voter suppression. And so the House of Representatives has been very clear in our assessment that we need to prepare for November, recognizing that during a time of a pandemic crisis, there are many people who will not be going to the polls. There are many people who should not, based on health reasons, potentially go to the polls. And we need to have the option for them in place to vote absentee, either in person or by mail. As so much of this, as this is in fact controlled at the state level, the House of Representatives has been talking about providing additional financial support to states, incentivizing states to encourage mailing out applications to those who might be interested in voting absentee. But frankly, with the current composition of the Senate, and certainly with the president we have in the White House, much of our ability to adapt to our current circumstance, avoid what we've seen in Georgia and in Wisconsin and in Baltimore, will be based on what happens locally. It will be the efforts of governors and secretaries of state or the Commonwealth who either choose to, as they have recently done in Michigan, send out applications to every registered voter for an absentee ballot. It will also be incumbent on campaigns like ours to really provide an education, particularly here in Virginia, with the newer composition of our House of Delegates and State Senate. We've had some changes in what it takes to be able to vote absentee. Notably, we've previously been a state that's been rather restrictive in the way that we require people to have an excuse for needing to vote absentee. We have shifted that. We now have no excuse absentee voting, which is a tremendous shift and really good for democracy, but also a point of education for so many Virginians who may not know that that is in fact an option or what the process is. Initially in Virginia, as like many other states, when someone chooses to vote absentee for the first time that they're also voting, there are additional hurdles. And they need to provide a photocopy of their driver's license. For some, they need to have a signature that's matched nearly identical to their voter registration. And some of these hurdles might really disadvantage newer voters and particularly younger voters. And so, unfortunately at this point, much of what will need to happen will be happening with advocates, with campaigns, and at the state level.
I know the advocates are all in. We've got the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, and of course the NAACP Voter Defense Funds. More places to put your money, people. What environmental programs will the Biden administration pursue to reverse the actions taken under the Trump administration? So
just a little bit of level setting. We see it every day that the climate crisis is real. Shorter winters, drier summers, flooding, more extreme weather events. I serve as the chair of the Conservation and Forestry Committee. And in that capacity, we focus on forest fires. And, you know, in my conversations with leadership over at the Forest Service, they say it used to be forest fire season. Now it's just a fire year because the extreme weather events, the lack of rain, the drier conditions have really created a crisis mode. It is a crisis that is felt within our agricultural communities where there has been changes to their ability to grow what have previously been profitable crops. And the change is real. Notably, and I'll mention this to anyone who doesn't know, Vice President Biden, back when he was in the Senate in 1986, introduced one of the very first climate change bills into the Senate. Based on that, PolitiFact has actually called him a climate change pioneer. So this is an area that, you know, maybe the vice president is known more for his foreign policy experience in his role as vice president under President Obama, but indeed he has been an advocate for engagement on this issue. He has a transformational climate plan ready to tackle the threat and to seize the opportunity of today. His goals and priorities are to invest $1.7 trillion to build a clean energy economy and with a net zero emissions by 2050. And the thing that I think is important here is based on the estimates that the campaign is putting out, you know, that would net create about 10 million jobs. So particularly when we're looking at the economic crisis where we are right now in COVID and trying to determine the trajectory of rebuilding the United States economy, clean energy jobs, it's not just an investment in combating climate change, but it's also a significant investment in our communities and in job creation. His plan also includes $400 billion for clean energy research to help us develop the next generation of biofuels, solar and wind technology. And what I appreciate about this prioritization of the vice president's is in fact that it is proactive, because we need to be researching now what is the technology of the future so that we can be moving, ever continuously moving in a position of progress. His plan also includes the building of 500,000 new public charging outlets by the end of 2030. Around our country, there has been a pretty significant adoption of electric vehicle technology, but in fact, the availability of charging stations is a major hurdle for so many who might be inclined to purchase an electric vehicle. And so that bit of infrastructure will be incredibly important towards ensuring greater adoption and, of course, the benefits that come with moving away from traditional vehicle to an electric vehicle. The vice president is also committed to making sure that every dollar spent on infrastructure makes us more efficient and resilient. And there's a lot of great development in the area of infrastructure and construction, be it the development of mass timber or nanocellulose technology used in making cement more efficient and stronger, thereby requiring less of it and the economic or the environmental impact that comes with that. And so I'm pretty really pleased of the fact that when we're talking about infrastructure, as we do so frequently in Congress, that Vice President Biden has as a priority ensuring that when we're spending dollars on growing and building our infrastructure, we're also looking at investments in resiliency. And then as I serve on the Agriculture Committee, and I do represent a district that is largely agricultural and landmass, the Vice President is committed to working with American farmers to help them lead the way on fighting climate change and to ensure that they have the resources to do it and are paid for it. You know, some of the really interesting technologies that are used within the agricultural communities, or even efforts such as using cover crops that are good for carbon sequestration, are good for climate health and soil health, requiring less fertilizers, in some case less watering, but the output is greater. There's economic benefit for the farmer or producer to utilize some of these technologies, or in some cases it's actually just the growth of cover crops, but pursuing these changes and substantially changing the way one might practice the skill of farming, providing incentives and recognizing that when for a producer who's utilizing rotational grazing, the value of them putting up those riparian barriers to keep the waterways clean is significant to the larger community, and where they can be incentivized and help to do so in the larger fight against climate change. I'm glad that the Vice President sees that as a priority. And then one last thing to round it out, he's committed to rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. This gets back to the prior discussion about US global leadership and the Vice President's commitment to honoring our role in the world and ensuring our engagement on issues that are most important, not just to us, but to our allies around the world.
Well, you hit home with me on the matter of agriculture. Montgomery County is home to one of the national premier ag reserves, which is, I think, 100,000 acres of conservation area that is set aside specifically to maintain the viability of farming, and is going through a lot of the changes you're talking about, protecting the riparian areas and cover crops. Okay, enough from me. What are your thoughts on getting rid of the filibuster? I know you're not in the Senate. You may not have any thoughts, but.
I'll just speak frankly. I actually don't know Vice President Biden's opinion on this. You know, I think that that any ability to impede, debate and progress that can be abused to the point of like stagnation is problematic. I'm glad it doesn't exist in the House. Let's say that as well.
Fair enough. What do you see happening with Congress this election? Does the House stay blue? Can we flip the Senate?
So I think the House definitely stays blue. We won so many seats in 2018, and many of those have moved from toss-up areas to pretty securely, provided that my incumbent colleagues kind of put in the work. There are many districts, particularly those that Clinton won in the 2016 election, that where they should relatively, it will take work and it will take strong campaigning, but in a relatively straightforward manner, those members should stay in those positions. There's a number of us, myself included, who won in seats where Donald Trump won. In my district, he won by almost 7 points. So recognizing that I will now be on the ballot with him, like that will create unique challenges. I do think that we will maintain the majority in a pretty straightforward manner. I do think that many of the seats that were seats that Donald Trump won will in fact not only maintain their Democratic member of Congress, but will also go for Biden this time. But that's going to take a lot of work from those members of Congress, and certainly a lot of work from the Biden campaign. But I do think it's possible, and I think that that's what we'll see, at least if not all, but certainly many of them. I also think we have the room to flip a couple more seats. My priority is on holding where we are and not having any backward slide, but I do think there's a couple districts where we could really make some additional inroads and bring new colleagues to Washington. As it relates to the Senate, I think the numbers demonstrate that there's a couple seats that are looking really likely to flip, so that's good. And then there's some stretch seats that will be far, far harder. But if on the ground, with the congressional races, with the Biden campaign at the top of the ticket, I do think that there will be, there's reason to have a little bit more than hope. There's reason to have some optimism that we could, in fact, flip the Senate. I don't think we'll do it by a landslide or with a wide, comparable margin to how we flipped the House in 2018. But I do think it's possible to eke out the majority in the Senate. And that'll just require real dedicated focus work on the ground, which I do believe is possible this time around.
Yes, and I'm happy to say that a lot of our members are active in what I hear called the Core Four, which is Maine, Arizona, Colorado, and North Carolina. And anybody who is not active in them out there, please change that. Let's see, has the campaign considered doing its own COVID-19 briefings since Trump has stopped, something along the lines of what Governor Cuomo had been doing? The Cuomo comparison is one I can't directly specifically address, but I will say that during this relatively the unique challenge of campaigning during a pandemic, the Biden campaign continues to look for new ways to engage. Notably, and people have talked about this a lot in the media, the vice president's built a studio in his house. He's had over 160 million views of video content there. One of the things that he's been doing pretty aggressively as well
which is, a change in the time of COVID, is a lot of more local news interviews. And so those may not always be visible, wherever we might be located. But that local outreach, I think, is incredibly important. He's been engaged with digital and traditional media. He's done interviews on morning cable and late night TV, local news. Again, and I think as a representative in a district where, I'm trying to stay and endeavoring to stay really engaged, a lot of that happens through local news sources. And so, I take a lot of time to do interviews with the local news. I always do, quite frankly, but during COVID, the information that I'm providing, I think is perhaps even more important. And so the fact that the Biden campaign and that the vice president continues, typically if he were, traveling across the country at such a pace that may not be a level of engagement he'd be able to pursue. But I do think that that's a valuable place where they've been pursuing real strong engagement. He's been doing digital events and town halls with everybody from young people to frontline workers, families, and partnering with those who've endorsed him. Quite a few, strong name people who have really been advocating for his campaign. He'll continue to hold virtual press conferences, digital events, and town halls. And whether they might mirror some that we've seen from other politicians, I can't speak to that. But they've also endeavored to try and find new ways to convey what I believe to be Joe Biden's real strength, which is his ability to connect with people and convey his real passion for service and his empathy. And they've even added a virtual rope line to try and continue to keep those one-on-one connections that so frequently, candidates like the vice president and even congressional candidates like me love to have those moments of one-on-one time, even if it's just for a moment. And so they're trying to create that as possible in a more virtual setting.
Okay, and then I guess this will have to be the final one. I know you've got a very tight schedule. Your thoughts on vice president, and also do you know of any timeline for that? And the second one is whether you think our esteemed dear leader is going to actually take up the typical presidential candidate debate, or is he just gonna slide through that? Just your thoughts on any of those.
My thoughts on the debate, I have a hard time imagining that there will be a debate of a traditional manner. I welcome the opportunity to be proven wrong on that, but I don't perceive it. Even now, the CNN put out a poll showing that the vice president, or that Biden is leading Trump, and the administration has challenged them to offer an apology and rescind that. So I think that the president may not be inclined, and this is just my assessment, might not be inclined for a head-to-head challenge because, even in reports of polls, he's been unwilling to hear the face that head-to-head challenge. As it relates to vice presidential choices, I think Biden has a lot of really, really good options. I am not involved in the selection process. He's selected a really strong group of people for that selection process. And Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's my colleague from Delaware, is a wonderful, wonderful member of Congress, a wonderful person. And so, I'm glad that she is part of that effort. I don't have any special knowledge of who he might choose, but I will say that my personal preference is that they take into account who can win, who can add to the ballot, who can be wholly additive. We are in a position where we have a presidential nominee who has such a tremendous scope of experience as a long-term legislator, as a vice president. And I think that really we're in a position where there's not a clear hole for someone to fill, as, even with President Biden, with President Obama, Vice President Biden was a really strong choice for a variety of reasons, including his strong foreign policy experience. But so there's not a policy piece or anything that I think is, a clear strength that he would need to bring to the table to augment his skill set. Some of the top names being mentioned, I think, are tremendous in their own right and as individuals. And so, it's not that I'm non-committal on this. It's frankly that I think I'm excited about all of the options, and it's a little bit like, you know, which type of ice cream to have. I mean, they're all good. I don't need to pick until it's actually, you know, the day of the party. So that's how I look at it. I'm excited about the possibility of any of, you know, the women who've been named. I'm appreciative of the fact that in fact he's committed to naming a woman.
Mhm.
I think that's incredibly important, and he's got a number of really amazing women to choose from.
Well, great. Thank you. That was tremendous, Congresswoman. Thank you so much. And I know you've got a tight schedule, so we're going to let you go. I hope you can join us for your colleague Mark Warner's event on June 19th at 1 o'clock. And I urge the rest of you out there in voterland to leap into the fray if you're not already in. It is past time to get busy rescuing our democracy. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope to see you on the 19th. Stay safe and stay engaged.
Thank you.
Thank you.